Happy Friday, everyone. It's so nice to have made it through another week, isn't it? It's good to have you all around the fire today as we delve into another cozy horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you set up with 5 more great stories, and I think I've got a pretty good theme today. Today's theme is about invasion, about that sense of fear that you get when your sanctuary, your comfortable place, is invaded by something outside of your control. And I truly think I've found 5 stories that put it into perspective pretty well. Let's start off with a story about eating at a restaurant that you like with people you trust, when suddenly you find yourself accosted by the unknown, and you're trapped and unable to leave. So let's hear a story about being trapped in the booth.
I hadn't wanted to go to Applebee's, but my friends insisted. I'm not opposed to going out for a meal, but I hate going to Applebee's in our town. It's a gathering place for every half-drunk Chad and happy-hour drunk who doesn't have enough money to drink at the yacht club, but has too much class to go to the Tilted Stool. We aren't big drinkers. I mean, we like to tie on a few sometimes, but these guys get downright sloppy. We get a booth as far from the bar as we can, and it's still so damn noisy in there. By the end of the night, we're all yelling at each other just to be heard over the jukebox or the drunks. I spend the rest of the night with my eardrums pounding and my head ready to crack open. At least that's how it's always been until tonight. So, we're in the back booth, like always, when I see the guy. Mark was talking about some girl he was seeing from work, Frank laughing like a donkey. His latest drink bounced around, threatening to spill as he pounded the table, and I looked up from my cowboy burger, just in time to see this guy hunkered over his food at the end of the row. He was bent over his plate, top of his bald head gleaming, and the light overhead lit him like a wax sculpture. I'm not usually one for people watching, but this guy kind of stood out. He reminded me of a story from Temple, back when I still went with my parents. They told us a story about a guy who'd built a creature to get revenge, a golem, and that was my first thought when I saw this guy. It sounds a little harsh, but I only mean he appeared not like a man, more like the approximation of a man. He had a white button-up, a red tie hanging loose around his neck, and even from here I could see the sweat starting to pool under his arms. Despite the noise, I could hear him almost perfectly, too. At first, I thought he was eating his meal real loudly, bent over at the waist like a dog. But the longer I watched, the more I thought he might be crying. His shoulders were hitching in slow up and down jerks, and he appeared to be sobbing into his plate. I felt a little voyeuristic as I watched him. Poor guy was probably living what was the worst day of his life. He'd probably been stood up for a date or lost his mom, and here I was just watching. When Mark nearly leaned into my ear, I jumped a little when he spoke. "What you looking at, Pally?" He followed my line of sight and found the poor guy before I could. Whew! That's a guy who's got a date with a rope later. Frank turned to look, but winced as Mark kicked him. "Don't look! Ain't you got no sense?" Poor fella. Kinda looks like this guy that came into the gas station the other night. He comes in high as a kite, and when I wouldn't sell him beer, he just starts crying, and Mark went on, but I wasn't really paying any attention anymore. I felt a little bad for continuing to watch him, but I just couldn't turn away. Something about him was mesmerizing. It was like driving past a car crash and being unable to stop staring at the bodies on the pavement. You know it's wrong to stare, but you just can't stop. Frank was braying laughter again, and I could see our waitress contemplating whether to cut him off or not as she came to get our plates. Mark told her he was fine, and Frank ordered another beer. And after several tense seconds and an elbow from Mark, I snapped back to myself and said I was okay too. "Geez, buddy," Mark said as the waitress shuffled off. "You gonna go over and propose?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, biting into my burger and realizing it was about lukewarm. Had I really been staring at that poor guy as my burger turned to ice? "You've been staring at him for like 10 minutes. Thought you were gonna order him a drink for a minute." We all laughed, mine being a little forced, and then Mark stood up and waved to a pair coming through the door. Jim and his wife Celine waved at us in turn, and Frank moved to our side of the table so the two lovebirds could sit together. They'd been inseparable since college, and I don't think I'd ever seen one without the other more than a handful of times. They excused their lateness. Their sitter had been late, and Jim started in on a story about how she had gotten lost and turned down the wrong road, when I turned my attention back to the poor guy 2 booths down. He was still bent over his burger, still quietly sobbing, but the way his shoulders moved had started to seem wrong. I was no expert on sobbing, but this guy's herky-jerky movements were starting to look like something else. A rational part of me chastised myself for continuing to stare at this poor guy, but I was like a moth to flame now. He was my car wreck, and I was starting to notice signs of foul play. When he snorted loudly, I heard the laughter for the first time. It made me shiver a little as I heard it thrum into me like a badly played piano note. The guy wasn't crying. He was laughing. The more I looked, the more I could see bits of meat and lettuce sprayed over the tabletop. The longer I looked, the more I wondered how I'd misunderstood his laughter for crying. I was now drawn deeper into this web of strangeness. No escape in sight. Crying was one thing. I could understand crying, but who sits in a booth by themselves and laughs? Was he nuts? Some kind of mental case who was off his meds? Watching him from behind Selena's shoulder, I wondered if he might be dangerous. Maybe we should leave. Maybe I should suggest that we change venues, but all thought of escaping fled from me as he lifted his head from that plate. The scream that welled up inside me was cut off by my constricted throat and likely sounded like nothing so much as a sigh. The man's face looked like a fantastic bit of prosthesis. It was like a piece of Halloween decoration that's just a little too realistic. The kind you worry might contain a person who wants to bite. His face looked like the front of a thumb, calloused and rippled with wrinkles or ridges. His eyes were like colorless slits, something slashed into his face with a knife. His nose appeared to be drawn on, like a cartoon character's. He was unreal, something that shouldn't exist in polite society outside of a circus tent. His mouth, though, his mouth was the worst. His mouth was full of long, needle-like teeth, reminding me of an anglerfish as it protruded from his thin lips. Those teeth looked like they would never close comfortably. From here, it looked like they would constantly poke at your lips and gums, and you would be in agony most of the time. There were pieces of meat on those teeth, red raw chunks that had been speared by them, and that's when I looked down at the plate. It was covered in the grisly remains of what looked like chunks of raw hamburger meat. I doubted like hell that the staff had just handed this guy raw beef, but the alternative seemed even wilder. The alternative was that this man had brought his own raw meat from home so he could just consume it here in public. As the horror ran through me like ice water, I looked up to see those colorless slits observing me. The two of us just stared at each other for a count of 5. Then he pulled those thin lips and monstrous teeth into a smile, and I could see red pooling at the edges of his flesh. I glanced over at Mark and Frank, both now sitting on my side of the booth, but neither of them had noticed him. The four of them were involved in a conversation like there wasn't a monster sitting 12 feet from us. It seemed impossible that anyone could be having a normal conversation so close to that creature. Its very presence should have triggered some ancient primal node deep in our brains and forced us to either destroy it or flee from it. The four of them were talking about jobs and school and Jim and Celine's daughter, while this thing got to exist in humanity with the rest of us. It was too much to handle. Suddenly I wanted out. I wanted to be anywhere but there. I tried to tap on Mark to get him to move or to look up or just acknowledge that I was losing my mind within easy reach of him. But my body wouldn't respond. I managed to flick my fingers at his arm, bumping him a little, but he only rubbed a hand over it as if a bug had landed on him. Celine was talking about the new Pokemon game, and Mark and Frank were just nerdy enough and broke enough to be enraptured by her descriptions. I was stuck in a state of eye contact with that thing, and the longer I looked, the more it seemed to drink me in with those strange eyes. Then, without warning, it began to sink down in its seat, becoming lost beneath its table. I panicked. Suddenly not being able to see it was worse than having it on display. Could it sink beneath our table? How far could it go? How close could it get? I was suddenly imagining the damage those teeth could do to a foot, even a foot within a shoe, and I pulled mine up a little higher as Selena's words washed over me. He didn't resurface for quite some time, and you would have said that such a thing would not have gone unnoticed. Then he slid back up from under the table on the opposite side of the booth. He was grinning from ghastly ear to ear, and he looked like a little kid who's trying to play with the table behind them. There was still a table between us and him, but I was no longer sure how much protection that provided us. I didn't know his mental state, and whether he meant to do us harm or not. But when he dipped back down again, I started shaking. "What's wrong with you?" Mark asked suddenly, turning to look at me as I shuddered beside him. I pointed to the empty plate where the man had been sitting, and Mark looked over before scoffing loudly. "Oh no, your boyfriend left. Don't worry, I'm sure most of those guys at the bar will take you home if you ask them nicely enough." "What's going on?" Jim asked, noticing my discomfort and looking alarmed. "He's obsessed with the guy that's sitting a couple of tables back. Couldn't take his eyes off of him, I swear. Thought he was gonna try to console the guy for a minute. Dude was just sitting there crying, and this freak's over here looking at..." The bald, sweaty head began to surface behind Selena, and when I shouted for her to look out, the whole restaurant went dead silent. Jim and Selena turned to look, but there was nothing behind them. I'd had enough, though. I pushed Mark and Frank out of the way, freeing myself from the booth as I went to go check under the table behind us. He'd be crouching down there, grinning like the little goblin that he was. But as I got down on my knees and looked beneath, I was greeted by nothing but an empty space. The waitress asked me what I was looking for as I moved to look under his table as well, but by then I was already intent on leaving. I got in my car, threw the keys in the ignition, and sped off as fast as I could. Sitting at home now, I can't get that image out of my head. My phone's been blowing up, and I know my friends are worried. I can't make sense of it. What was that thing? Why did it take such an interest in me? Is it dangerous? Did it follow me home? Every time I close my eyes, I see those repulsive needle-like teeth and the no-color slits looking back at me. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything. Every time I close my eyes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to see anything but that creature again.
Before you say it, I know. That story really creeps me out as well. Applebee's. This next story is about a man's castle and the entertainment he keeps in the basement. But when the upstairs is laid siege by someone unexpected, he discovers that his kingdom might not be as safe as he thought it was. So let's hear a little story about trains in the basement.
Joe loved trains. He loved them since he was little, and it was a love affair that had lasted a lifetime. He had gotten his first train set when he was 5 years old, and though the models he had now were as different from that set as he was from the child he had been, he still remembered it fondly. His train set in the basement of the home he shared with his wife and daughter, and the table he had set up were so big that it took up nearly half the floor space. His wife often bemoaned how much room it ate up, but he ignored her for the most part. He paid the bills, he slaved away at work so his wife and daughter could live comfortably, and when he got home, all he really wanted to do was relax with his trains. He had a little cap he wore and a special pair of overalls, and he sat and listened to the trains chug along, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him anywhere else in life. He would sit down here for hours sometimes, just playing with his trains and letting life pass him by. He could hear his wife, Debbie, moving around upstairs, but he put her out of his mind, too. Debbie would call down to let him know that dinner was ready, and then he'd have to leave his cap on the hook and go upstairs and spend time with his family. His family. Ugh, they were so dull. His wife would ask him about his day, a day that had been boring and monotonous and would be better forgotten in the basement with his trains. Jennifer would talk about cheerleading or some boy she liked, and Joe would pick at his food as he listened to nothing but the clickety-clack of train wheels in his mind. He was dreading hearing her come down the stairs, consoling himself by watching the trains go by. That's when he noticed the house for the first time. The house had been purchased at a hobby store 2 towns over. His wife had complained when he had told her where he was going to get the things he needed for his train set, but it really couldn't be helped. The hobby shop in town was not the sort that stocked train things. The greasy man behind the counter, the one wearing the Led Zeppelin t-shirt and a shiny ponytail, had pushed his glasses up his nose and informed Joe that unless he were here to play Warhammer, they did not stock models for that sort of hobby. So, Joe had gone 2 towns over to find a man who carried his sort of hobby. He had gotten about 5 little wooden houses for his diorama that day, but it was only now that he realized one of them looked a lot like his house. He hadn't painted them, they had come just as they were, but as he watched his trains chug around the place, he could see that one of them was a white house with a tan roof and a picket fence that went all the way around it. Joe didn't remember having seen it before, but as the train came around to pass it, he found his attention suddenly pulled to it. It was like a scene in a movie where the shot zoomed in on a certain object, and Joe felt his eyes drawn there inexorably. The house was sitting next to the tracks, and whoever might take in the breeze in the evening on the front porch would have a great view of the trains as they went by. In fact, he thought he saw someone leaning on the windowsill doing just that. There couldn't be anyone doing that. Joe hadn't put any people in any of the houses, but he saw someone nonetheless. He couldn't make the fellow out. He was like a giant trying to see a passing sparrow. But the longer he stared, the more familiar the man looked. As the train rolled past and kicked its water vapor smoke into the air, he imagined that he could see someone watching it wistfully. Joe put it out of his mind, swapping his CB steamliner for a larger diesel engine, and went back to enjoying the trains. Even so, as they continued to rumble around the track, he was drawn back to that house again and again. The man leaned on the sill and watched the locos as Joe swapped out trains. Was he a man? Joe felt certain that he was. He was still leaning there, watching the trains roll past with fascination, when Debbie called down to tell him that dinner was ready. Joe glanced at the stairs, momentarily drawn out of his daze, but when he looked back at the little man, he was gone. Maybe his wife had called him to dinner too, Joe thought with a snort as he put his hat on the hook and climbed the stairs. He'd have plenty of time after dinner to search for him again as he ran his trains on their endless courses through the landscape that he had created. And Martha said that her daughter got accepted into Ohio State. After all that bragging about getting into Dartmouth, her daughter couldn't get any higher than our own little state college. It just goes to show you what bragging gets you. Joe was plowing absent-mindedly through his mashed potatoes as Debbie prattled on about some friend of hers whose daughter was apparently too dumb to get into her college of choice. Ohio State was a fine college. Joe had gone to Ohio State to get his degree in engineering, but he didn't feel like saying as much. If he just agreed with her and let her get it out of her system, then she'd likely let him get back to his basement so he could play with his trains. He glanced over at his daughter, Jessica, and saw that she was attached to her phone as usual. She didn't have time for much else these days, and between TikTok and Instagram, she barely seemed to be in the world. She had no time for her parents, just her friends and her fans. Joe didn't really care. He was no better if he thought about it, and her attention to the phone meant that he had more time with his trains. And then she said she might make her daughter wait a year so she can take the entrance exam to Dartmouth again. Can you imagine having such a stagger between high school and college? You would... Can I be excused? Jessica asked suddenly. Diana wants to go live in a few minutes. Jessica, you've barely touched your vegetables, Debbie lamented, but Jessica was already getting up and leaving. Me too, said Joe, taking his plate to the sink, his vegetables noticeably gone. Debbie pursed her lips as the two of them made their hasty way to their various hobbies. Sure, why not? I only cooked the dinner, but I suppose I'll do the dishes, too. Neither of them were listening, though. Joe was heading downstairs, Jessica taking the stairs to the second floor, 2 at a time, and Debbie was left sitting at the table. She wanted to cry. She wanted to rage at them, but she picked up her phone instead. She had a message there, a message that made her smile. And soon her absentee family was as far from her mind as Martha or her dummykin's daughter. The trains thundered over the plastic track, making their way through the little town that Joe had built for them. He could have as many as 5 trains going simultaneously on this setup, if he wanted to. As long as he kept his eyes on the switching times, they would never run afoul of each other. In the beginning, Joe had been afraid to run more than 2 at once, but now he was comfortable enough to run as many as he wanted. He could run 5 without even thinking about it, and that made him feel proud somehow. It was a silly thing to feel proud of, but he found that he did. And why shouldn't you feel proud? The rail line sure can't run itself, came a voice from the model below. Joe jumped a little, looking around to see who was talking. He looked at the steps, but there was no one there. He stood up, his chair making a harsh noise as he did, but as he looked across the basement, he couldn't find anyone there either. The voice hadn't been very loud, like a voice from outside, and he looked up to the little window near the top to see if someone was peeking in on him. Down here, hoss, came a voice from the model, and he looked down to see someone sitting on the porch of the house that had looked a lot like his. He didn't remember putting a rocking chair on that porch, but as he watched, it went back and forth, and a tiny little man watched the trains roll by. Joe leaned down, coughing as one of the trains belched smoke as it went by, and as he looked, he saw the weathered face and overalls of an old man. He looked like a farmer, what his dad would have called a corn husker, and he had a little pipe in his mouth that was making its own smoke. Joe leaned down beside the house, and if the man was bothered by the presence of a giant man looming over him, he never showed it. "'Bout time you noticed me. I've been waiting." Joe was speechless for a moment, trying to figure out a sense to the sudden arrival of this miniature man. Who are you?" he finally settled on. "Me? Why, I'm Bill Williams, remember?" Joe furrowed his brow. He didn't, but the name did sound familiar. The old man laughed. Don't tell me you forgot your own town of Macklin. You built it, after all. Joe nodded. He had thought of the little town here as Macklin, named after the little town that he had grown up in. But he didn't think he had ever actually written anything down to christen it so. Come to think of it, the house here was where he had decided that Bill Williams would live. It was something he had been thinking about as he planned to put down mailboxes outside the homes, and this was the house that he had planned to set the Williamsons' box outside of. Joe nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I had been planning to flesh the town out some. And not a moment too soon. We were feeling a little two-dimensional down here. Fred was just saying the other day. Fred? Joe asked. Bill cocked a finger at the house next door. Yes, sir, Fred Murphy. He's only lived here since his folks passed a couple years ago, but we're real fond of him. He got his leg blown off in Korea, but he's got one of them new prosthetic legs, and he gets around just fine. As he said it, a little guy came out of the house next door and wished his wife a fond farewell. He had a pretty noticeable limp, but Bill was right. It didn't slow him down in the least bit as he went down the steps and climbed into a little blue Datsun Matchbox car that Joe had glued into place there. To Joe's further surprise, he started the car up and drove off down the road. It sure was swell of his old man to leave him the hardware store down on 5th Street. Fred does a swell job of running it now, and we all thank him for it. The blue Datsun took its time as it went from the little red house beside Bill's to the hardware store about 3 streets over. Joe had made it from a kit that he'd picked up at Walmart around Christmas time, but as Fred climbed out and stumped towards the festive cardboard building, Joe thought it looked far more three-dimensional than he remembered. He'd been so busy focusing on Fred and his shiny blue car that he jumped a little as the post truck drove by and a hand came out of the window to put mail in the box. Right on time. Letter carrier Loretta is always so punctual. We were sure sad to see Charlie retire, but Loretta has been a great mail lady in his absence. Her daughter just got into Ohio State. Did you know that? We're all so proud of her. It's quite a school. Joe was practically kneeling beside the table as it all came to light before his very eyes. His trains weren't the only thing moving suddenly, and he saw people going to the shops and driving their cars over the streets. A little bell rang as a group of kids left the schoolhouse, heading for home. Some people went into the department store he had built on Main Street, while a few others went to the bank. There were homes to go back to, dinners to eat, TVs to watch, and Joe seemed to be master over all of it as he watched it all stretch out before him. Bill knew them all, every story, every home, and he regaled Joe with countless tales of their lives. Joe, for his part, was enthralled. He sat listening to Bill as the sun began to set outside the little window above his head, and when it became too dark to see, he reached up to pull the light cord, almost absent-mindedly. The Christmas lights he had strung above the model twinkled like stars, and Joe saw headlights wink on as people made their way home or out for other activities. When his wife called to tell him that she was going to bed and asked if he meant to stay down there with his trains all night, Joe realized it was nearly 10 o'clock. He had spent all afternoon down here talking to Bill about the little town he had made out of cardboard and model kits, and now he needed to get some shut-eye. Needed to, but didn't really want to. Land sakes, Bill said, checking his watch. I gotta get to bed. Sorry, Hoss, but we'll have to continue this some other time. Tomorrow, maybe, he said, and Joe thought he looked almost as hopeful as Joe was. Of course, Joe said hurriedly. I'll come down right after work. Sounds like a plan to me. See you tomorrow, Joe, Bill said. He went into his house, and Joe reached up to turn the lights off before deciding to leave them on. Let the little people enjoy the stars tonight. Joe couldn't honestly remember a better week in his life. It had been hard to sleep that first night, his mind all a tizzy with the concept of a whole city in his basement. but he had finally managed to drop off. He had blown through his work the next day, finding joy in tasks that had been nothing but mundane until then, and he had finished early that day. He'd come home while his wife was out buying groceries and went straight to the basement to talk to Bill. The little man knew everyone in town, and Joe was so engrossed in his stories that his wife had come halfway down the stairs before he even heard her. "You're home early?" she said almost hopefully. "Yeah, I got done with my stuff early, so they said I could go," Joe said. They stood staring at each other as the smile slipped off her face. She had clearly been hoping that he had come home early to surprise her, but it was becoming apparent that he had come home early to play with his trains. Joe couldn't understand her sudden interest or the increasing slip back towards this interest. She had expected something, maybe? Had he forgotten something, like a birthday or an anniversary? He was bad at remembering those. Joe often found it hard to relate to people. He sometimes wondered why Debbie had agreed to marry him at all, but he believed that she had once found these things endearing in him. Joe wasn't sure what had changed, but it wasn't him. "Well, I'll just leave you to it. Dinner should be ready in a little while. I'll call you." She went back upstairs, the door closing a little harder than it strictly needed to when she got to the top. Wonder what that's about?" Bill asked. Joe had only shrugged, and the rest of the week had gone by much the same. If Debbie seemed more distant than usual, Joe hadn't noticed. If she spent more time on her phone, what of it? Jessica spent most of her time on the phone. Maybe Debbie had found something to do on her phone, too. He spent most of his time in the basement talking to Bill as he learned about the fascinating history of the town and its people. The longer they talked, the more real the town seemed. The buildings took on definition. The cardboard surfaces became three-dimensional. The pictures on the outside seemed to grow, the barrels and bicycles and signs they bore, and the whole town came to life before his eyes. Before Joe knew it, it was Sunday, and he was sitting in the basement with Bill having a beer. "Joe, we're friends, aren't we?" Bill asked suddenly. Joe nodded, not having to give much thought to it. "Yeah, Bill, I'd say we are. And friends tell people things they suspect might change their lives, don't they?" Joe nodded a little slower, not sure where this was going. "Well, Joe, they say a man's home is his castle, and I believe your wife is trying to invite a dirty rascal into your castle." Joe's eyebrows knit together. "What you mean, Bill?" "I mean, your wife was down here doing laundry a couple of days ago, and she was talking to somebody on the phone. Conversation was getting, shall we say, a little spicy. And I thought to myself, good for Joe. He deserves a little something extra. But when she called the fella by name, the name wasn't Joe. This guy's name was Simon, and it seems your old lady is really taken with him." Joe wasn't sure how to process this. Why would Debbie cheat on him in the first place? He paid the bills, maintained the insurance, kept the cars up, fixed the house when it needed it, and paid a handyman when he couldn't fix it. He did all the things that were expected of him, and if she felt uncared for, why hadn't she said something? "Bill," Joe said, not really sure what to say, "are you sure?" "I think I am, Joe. Think you may need to get your house in order. Now, I say this as your friend, Joe, but it ain't right for a woman to run around on a man like that. She needs to be corrected, Joseph. She needs to be reminded who's in charge around here." Joe shuddered as he took a sip of his beer. No one had called him Joseph in a long time. The only person who called him Joseph was his father, and he was dead and in the ground. The name felt like footsteps on his grave, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Joe perked up his ears as he heard footsteps overhead, the clank of plates as they were set out, drawing him back to reality. Sounds like dinner's ready. I should go, Bill. Debbie will be expecting me." Sure, Bill said. "Man needs his victuals. Come back when you can, Joe. I'm not going anywhere." Joe went slowly up the stairs, watching the model get smaller and smaller as he climbed. He wasn't sure he would be back after dinner. Joe might have lost his taste for trains. Just a little bit. Joe grimaced as he ate the hamburger helper. Joe hated hamburger helper. The noodles were always mushy, the cheese always tasted funny, and there was just something unnatural about the concoction. It really wasn't a fit meal for Sunday dinner anyway. Debbie usually made ham or burgers or something with some substance. He would be hungry again in no time after a meal like this. Jessica was picking at her food, but Debbie's was still untouched. She was glued to her phone, texting someone, and by the look on her face, she was enjoying the conversation. There was a look there that Joe had never seen before, not even when they were dating, but it was a look he knew. It was that sultry look that women sometimes got when they were talking to someone they liked, maybe even liked a lot. "I might go see some friends after dinner," Debbie said, taking up her plate and dumping the cooling lump back into the pan. "You guys may have to fend for yourself for bedtime." Jessica shrugged. "Sounds good. Have fun, Mom." She didn't even bother to look at Joe. Debbie just went upstairs to get ready, leaving him to take care of cleanup. He was still scrubbing when she left, and when he asked when she would be back, Debbie just said not to wait up. Joe couldn't help but notice she was wearing her favorite dress, the black one without sleeves, and that this was usually a date night outfit. It had been a while since they'd had a date night, not since her birthday a few months ago, but Joe recognized the dress. He finished the scrubbing and grabbed another beer, heading for the basement again. He needed to talk to someone, and Jessica certainly wasn't going to be any help in this situation. The following week was so different from the one before it that Joe almost felt like he had whiplash. Debbie went out almost every night, and when she was in, she was glued to her phone. She took her phone calls outside or upstairs in her room these days, and he had noticed some new clothes hanging on the closet door. You would have said this would be great, Joe left to his own devices to pursue his interests, but something had changed after Bill had told him about his suspicions. He didn't suddenly find himself afraid of losing Debbie. This wasn't a Hallmark movie, but he did worry about how this would change his routine. Suddenly the prospects of not having as much disposable income, of having dinner late, or his responsibility, or having to worry about clean clothes and dishes in the sink, was a real problem. Then, of course, there was the little voice whispering in his ear as he sat in the basement, contemplating his situation. "She's making a fool out of you, Joseph, strutting around with someone else, probably already in his bed and violating her wedding vows. She's putting cuckold's horns on you, and that ain't right." Joe drank his nightly beer, the bottles becoming plural as the week went on, and thought about what Bill was saying. It's impossible," Joe said at first. "Why would she do such a thing? I'm a great provider. She'd have no reason to go looking for someone else." Bill had snorted. "Who knows, Joseph? Sometimes women are just unreasonable. They feel like what they have isn't good enough, so they go looking for something on the side. Who can say what's going through her head?" Joe didn't want to believe it, but he was slowly beginning to come around. As he and Bill sat and listened to the trains run and the town thrive, Joe wished he could go live in Macklin himself. Life in Macklin looked simple, and Joe could use something simple right now. His life had become very complicated as of late, and he wanted to return to something more wholesome, a place where wives and daughters honored their father for his sacrifice, and dinner was on the table when he got home, a place where people were satisfied with their lot. By Thursday, Joe was certain that his comfortable life was coming unraveled. He came down in the same clothes he'd gone to work in, not feeling like dressing in his conductor's overalls much these days, and found Bill sitting with Fred on the porch as the two smoked their cigarettes. They had been talking quietly as he came down, but they looked up and waved as he noticed them. "Got some bad news, Joe," Bill said, taking a long drag off his cigarette before letting the smoke out like some kind of a wrinkled dragon. Your old lady had a friend over to the house today." This was news to Joe, since Debbie hadn't been here when he'd come home. He'd found the breakfast dishes in the sink, the clothes still on the line, and his wife gone off somewhere. Joe told himself that she was getting things for dinner, but who knows? Was she out with friends, or just one friend? He didn't know that either, but he was beginning to suspect it was just the one friend now. "How can you be sure?" Joe asked, not wanting to believe it. "Shoot, Joseph, you could hear him carrying on up there. I'd imagine there's a few loose springs in your bed these days. Then they left again, and then you came home about an hour later." Joe sat down heavily, trying to make sense of all of it. This can't be happening. I refuse to believe this is happening," Joe said, putting his face in his hands as he rested his head on the table. "Afraid it is, hoss," Bill said, taking another long drag off his cigarette. "I'm just glad my Millie never strayed like this. Think we both know what would have to happen if she did, don't we?" he said, he and Frank nodding in unison. Joe opened his fingers as he turned his head. What would have to happen? "Well, let's just say there'd be a fresh plot in the backyard if my old lady tried to step out on me like that." Joe was silent for a few seconds, seeming to weigh Bill's words as he thought about what he was saying. I could never do anything like that." Bill gave him a hard look, no mean feat for someone with eyes that small, before shrugging. "Nah, I guess not. I guess we're just cut from different cloth, hoss." Joe went back upstairs, the basement suddenly not seeming so inviting. The house above was quiet. Jessica hadn't come home, spending the night with a friend, and Debbie was still out. Joe went to the kitchen to see if there was anything to eat, but most of it looked less than appetizing. In the end, he just sat there as night fell outside, his stomach grumbling and his anger rising. Who was Debbie out there with? Had she actually brought them to the house? He wondered briefly if what Bill was telling him was real, if the little people of his train town were real, but the thought wouldn't hold. Of course they were real. They spoke to him, and he had seen them with his own eyes. Joe wasn't imaginative enough to create something like that from whole cloth. Joe liked trains, he liked to build, but he wasn't delusional. The idea that this might be some kind of psychotic break never even occurred to him. In his mind, everything was ordered, and Joe had everything in its proper place. The headlights of Debbie's car slid across him as she pulled into the driveway. He heard her come up the walk, heard her keys slide into the lock, and as she came in, he watched her take her shoes off before coming inside. She was creeping in like a kid out past curfew, and when she saw him lurking in the dark living room, she jumped and screamed, dropping her shoes. "Jesus, Joe," she said, putting her hand to her chest. You scared me to death." Joe didn't say anything, just watched her as she bent down to collect her shoes. "Were you expecting dinner? Sorry, I went out with some of the girls. I figured you could manage for yourself for a night." She was smiling. All smiles was his Debbie. But when he didn't say anything or get up to follow her, she sighed and rolled her eyes. "Are you mad or something? It was just one meal. It's not like you pay me any attention when I'm here anyway. Figured you'd be thrilled to have the house to yourself. Just you and your trains." She stood looking at him for a count of 12, but Joe really couldn't think of anything to say. "Fine, be that way," she said dismissively. "I'm going to bed. Good night." As she went up, Joe began to feel a little guilty about thinking she might be stepping out on him. He'd been paranoid. Surely it was nothing. She had a good life here, but it seemed it was getting a little mundane for her. She just wanted to go out more and do some fun things. Joe was a bit of a homebody. Maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world if he had to cook a meal for himself now and then. As the Starrlight came on, though, Joe saw something that made him rethink. He had been on the verge of rising, meaning to apologize for being weird, when he saw a purple mark on her neck. It wasn't huge, wasn't ghastly, but it was big enough to be noticed by Joe from his seat on the couch. She had made no effort to hide it, may not have even been aware it was there, but as she headed upstairs, Joe headed down to the basement instead. He owed Bill an apology, it seemed. The weekend went by without much trouble. Joe spent most of it home by himself since Jessica went to stay with a friend and Debbie went on a girls' weekend with her friends. Friends, Joe thought, as she kissed his cheek and walked out the door with her suitcase. Right. He believed that, as much as he believed that the hickey she had covered with makeup was a rash. By the time the two of them came back Sunday night, Joe was ready for Monday. He'd practiced a few times, a few of those times ending painfully, and as he slid back in through the basement window, he made no sound. He had eaten his breakfast that morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and left for work, just as he had 100 times before. Then he pulled into the parking lot of the Dunkin' Donuts about 3 blocks away and called his boss to tell him he wasn't feeling well and that he'd be taking the day off. His boss had understood, had told him he hoped he felt better, and Joe had slid his slacks off to reveal jogging pants underneath. His polo came off too, revealing a tight jogging shirt, and he added a hat and some sunglasses before leaving the car and jogging up the road. When he came to his house 30 minutes later, there was already a car in the driveway. It appeared she hadn't wasted any time. As he came slowly around the side of the house, he could see the two of them embracing in the living room. Debbie with her hands all over a dark-haired man, a little younger than Joe. Joe could have probably come right in through the front door without them noticing, and they worked their way upstairs as he made his way to the basement window. He couldn't believe she was doing something like this in the living room, with the curtains open nonetheless. Anyone could see her. He was in through the window in a matter of seconds, and no one in the house was the wiser. As he came to the head of the stairs, he reached down beside the banister and felt for what he had hidden there. Joe wasn't a violent man, but he understood the need for home defense. His father had owned this particular shotgun since Joe was a kid. When he died, Joe had taken it to his house. Debbie hadn't liked it, saying that Jessica might hurt herself with it, so Joe had always kept it in the basement. He had thought it was stupid then, but now he was glad that she hadn't let him put it in the bedroom closet like he'd wanted. It would have been harder to lay hands on there. "Good luck," Bill said from the model, and Joe nodded to him as he made his way quietly up the stairs. He could hear them as he came into the kitchen, but the basement door had been oiled, so it wouldn't give him away. They would never know how many times he had practiced this, how many times he had crept from the basement to the bedroom. This would definitely qualify as premeditated if he was caught, and any investigator worth his salt would be able to tell. Joe didn't care, though. Bill had already let him know that this was something a husband did when he loved his wife and needed to let her know her place. That place, Joe knew, would be in the backyard by the oak tree. There were clothes scattered around the living room, but nothing too intimate. A sock here, a pair of stockings here, a shirt thrown across the couch, a shoe by the door, and all in line towards the stairs. They'd been busy already, and Joe wondered what she would have done if he had forgotten something and had to come back. Joe realized that she knew him too well, though. He never forgot anything. Joe was meticulous, driven by his routine, and he would have no more forgotten something he needed than he would have left without his pants. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to them as they did their cheating on the floor above. It was shameful. She'd never made noises like that for him, even when he had been interested in things like that. She had mostly just lain there, dutifully, but it sounded like she was being more than dutiful for him. He stopped again at the midpoint as the stair creaked a little, but they were making too much noise by then. They didn't even hear as he slid the door open, but when he cocked the shotgun and pointed it at the pair of them, Debbie screamed in something other than passion. The gun blammed before either of them could make their case, and Joe was left standing there in the aftermath. Joe came running into the basement, slamming the door behind him and throwing the lock. He could see the flashing lights from the basement window, and he knew that they'd be coming down the stairs any time now. His plan hadn't been quite as well planned as he had thought, and now it was all coming apart. He had stood there in the bedroom, looking over what he had done for several minutes before he heard sirens coming from up the street some. There was no way they had already been called about the gunshot. Less chance that they were close already. Someone had to have seen him go into the house. Someone who had then heard the shots while they were still on the phone with the emergency services. Now they had his number, and he was out of escape routes. Joe went to the model, looking down at Bill's house as he tried to find the old man. For one terrible second, he was worried that he wouldn't be there, that it would have all been a trick or a delusion, and that he had done all this for nothing. No cars moved on the street, no people walked between the buildings, and as the voice came from the floor above, Joe started to shake. Bill, I need your help. The cops are after me, Bill. No answer. Joe heard something heavy hit the front door, rattling the frame. Bill! Bill said nothing. The loud bang came again. Bill! Joe yelled, hearing something break upstairs as whatever they were hitting the door with broke the frame. What's all the ruckus, hoss? Joe looked down, seeing Bill as he stuck his head out of the window of the second story. His hair was standing in corkscrews, and he was rubbing his eyes sleepily. Bill looked as if Joe had awoken him from some deep sleep, and Joe wondered how anyone could sleep through something like that. Joe's heart was hammering like the cops on his door, and his blood pressure felt ready to send his heart out of his chest. Bill, thank God. Listen, the cops are at the door. They're going to arrest me. Oh, Bill said, leaning out the sill. Well, that is a problem. The two were quiet for a moment, staring at each other, and Joe winced as he heard the door cave in under their blows and boots as they came into the foyer. What do I do? Joe asked. Bill said, the police upstairs telling Joe to come out with his hands up. I suppose you could turn yourself in, let them know you caught your wife cheating, and just kind of snapped. Joe heard someone test the lock on the basement door before calling for help. Aw, Bill said, you could always come live here. Joe looked surprised. You mean in Macklin? Sure. You know, we've been looking for a conductor for the railroad. You could live at the railway house, drive the trains, and never worry about anything ever again. Someone drove a boot into the basement door, and the lock shuddered. How? Joe asked. Bill extended a hand. Come with me, Joe. Come away from all that and live with decent folks. Bill's whole hand wouldn't fit on the end of Joe's finger, but as he reached carefully towards him, the tingle that ran through him was worse than the most painful Charlie horse he had ever had. When he opened his eyes, however, he was face to face with the smiling old man. Joe, Bill said, casting a hand out to the city, welcome to Macklin. Jessica opened the basement door and looked down into the darkness. It had been 5 years since her mother's death and her father's disappearance, and Jessica hadn't been back since the day her grandparents had driven away from her childhood home. She was 22 now, about to leave for college, and was hoping to maybe get a little help with tuition after she sold the house. Everything else that her parents had owned had been sold and the money placed in trust for her, but she wasn't allowed to touch it until she was 25. Great. Thanks, Mom and Dad. That was really going to help her pay for college. Selling the house would more than get her what she needed, but Jessica hated coming back here. The house had remained untouched for the last 5 years. The locals thought it was haunted. Most of them also thought her dad was secretly living in it, and he had taken refuge in the walls after killing her mom. But if he had, then no one had ever found him. Everyone believed he had killed her mother, shot her and her lover in the bed that they had shared, and then made a clean escape. Jessica had mixed feelings about the situation, feelings that made grieving difficult when the wound was fresh. On the one hand, her mom had been cheating on her father, and that was bad. On the other, her father was such a cold and obtuse person that it was a wonder her mother hadn't cheated on him before that. She had known her father for her entire life and knew little about him, beside the fact that he liked trains. She couldn't remember a time when he had ever shown interest in something that she had liked, or even a time when he had just asked her about her day. It was sad when the most interesting thing about your father was that he might have killed your mother. The basement looked exactly the way she remembered it. The washer and the dryer still stacked with clean, unfolded clothes. The shelves still held a random assortment of things, and the train set still took up most of the floor space. Jessica grimaced. She would have to do something about it if she was going to sell the house. Some of those trains could even be worth money, she reflected. As if hearing her thoughts, something made an angry scutter across the tracks of the little town, and Jessica squeaked before retreating back up the stairs. Nuts to this, she would investigate the basement another day, maybe when Randy was free to help her. The basement had always been creepy to her, and that hadn't changed with time in the slightest. She slammed the door and went to look at the rest of the house, leaving the basement to its own devices. Joe felt the breeze as the diesel loco thundered down the tracks. He pulled the cord and listened to the whistle blow as he waved to the passers-by who had stopped to wait for the train. He couldn't remember anything before he had taken up the cap and overalls that made him the conductor of the Macklin line, but he was sure it hadn't been better than this. No wife, no kids, nothing but train times and passenger schedules. Sometimes when he wasn't driving the train, he sort of remembered someone from before he had come here. A woman and a girl, a house, a boring job, a boring life, but none of that really mattered. Joe was happy, happier than he had ever been, and as he drove past Bill's house, he waved to his old friend as he sat whistling on the porch. They would have some beers later, Millie cooking them another wonderful dinner, and then Joe would wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. Yes, sir, Macklin was the best little town in the whole damn world.
That's certainly not the last time we'll see the train table, or the town connected to it. So keep an eye peeled for it to resurface, probably a few more times. I'm a sucker for a good train story. Coming up next, we have a tale about a nickname that gets a little out of hand. Everybody likes a friendly nickname, a sense of community. But when this nickname gets connected with some rather heinous acts, it's less of a comfort and more of a burden. So let's hear a story about Tony Pizza.
My boyfriend has always had bad luck with nicknames. He calls me Shrimp, or Hot Stuff, or for like a week straight, he called me Tender Toes. But now, he started calling me the worst nickname ever. He calls me Tony Pizza. Why Tony Pizza, I asked him, but he just shrugged. Why not Tony Pizza? At first, I was a good sport about it. It made no sense, but what of it? Sometimes things just don't make sense. Soon, however, our other friends started calling me Tony Pizza. Hey, Tony Pizza's here, they would say, or yo, Tony Pizza. And it would annoy the crap out of me, but I took it. It's just a nickname after all. It couldn't hurt me if I didn't let it. Sticks and stones, etc., etc. When the phone calls started coming in, that was when it went too far. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through Netflix, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I sighed, figuring it was just telemarketers, but when I picked it up, the lady asked if she could speak with Tony. Who? I asked, thinking it was one of my friends playing a joke. Tony, she paused. and I could hear her flipping through pages. Tony Pizza. I rolled my eyes. Hardy har har. Who is this? Is that you, Margot? No. This is the National Debt Collection Service, and we're attempting to collect a debt on a Tony Pizza. I sighed. Tony Pizza is just my nickname. There isn't a real Tony Pizza. Well, real or not, they owe us $15,000 in credit card debt, and it landed on our desk. That dried my mouth up pretty quickly. How much? $15,000. So, are you Tony Pizza then? We talked for a while, me insisting that the name was just a nickname and not a real name, and the woman on the other end of the phone finally said that they would check their records again, but that all the data they had pointed to the person at this address who had my number. I hung up on her after assuring her that I would try to get my boyfriend to call them, and called his cell phone. This was a little more than a weird nickname now, and if he was trying to stick me with a bunch of weird debt, then I wasn't going to play ball. He'd been distant lately, this man who had professed such love for me, and I sensed him pulling away the last few times we'd been close. I should have sensed it before now, but I was always a little slow to pick up on others when they were preparing to go. I called a few of our mutual friends, even Margot, but they all said that they hadn't seen him today. They said that they'd keep an eye out for him, and when I told them why, they laughed. Classic Mike, they all said. And when I'd tried them all, I called him again. He was supposed to be at work, delivering pizzas for Domino's, but his cell phone went straight to voicemail every single time. I shook my head. He would do this on my only off day. I got dressed and decided to just walk down to the Domino's and see if I could catch him there. With any luck, he'd be waiting on an order and I could get him to answer some questions for me. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and my can of mace. Can't be too careful these days, right? I was walking past the manager's office when Mr. Dubry stuck his head out and called my name. I just wanted to discuss the rent on the other unit with you. It hasn't been paid in 2 months and I'm getting a little impatient. I raised an eyebrow. Other unit? What other unit? He shuffled some paperwork around before finally finding the one he was after. Unit 402, rented out to a, Tony Pizza. Really? This must have been passed on by my secretary. Regardless, it was your address as the primary address, so it must have been your Mike. I ground my teeth together. Now he was getting apartments with that stupid name, too. This was all becoming a little too much. What was he up to? When I found Mike, he was going to have a lot of explaining to do. I'm going to go find him right now, sir. Let me ask him what all this is about, because I haven't rented any apartment other than my own. I headed out then, the manager telling me to let him know what I discovered, and left the complex in a heated state. I was going to find him and give him a piece of my mind. He was going to answer for this if it was the last thing I did. I'd been worried that he was planning to leave me, but stealing from me and using a stupid nickname that he had given me to do it was a step too far. I made it to Domino's, but as I walked in, I had to stop myself from throwing my phone at the guy behind the register. Hey, it's Tony Pizza! Save it, Damien. Where's Mike? Damien scratched his head, one of his dreads bouncing. Dunno. He never showed up to work today. Somebody did show up looking for you, though. I lifted my eyebrow. For me? Who would come here looking for me? The cops, Damien said. You must have passed them on the street because they were just here. That made me nervous. The cops didn't just start looking for you for no reason. What did they want? They were asking about you, wanted to know if anyone had seen you. They said they were looking for someone named Tony Pizza, and you're the only one I know with that name. I felt like screaming, Tony Pizza, Tony Pizza, Tony fucking Pizza. What the hell was happening today? I hated that stupid nickname, and now it seemed to be following me everywhere. Was this some kind of elaborate joke that Mike was playing? If it was, it wasn't funny. I was getting pretty tired of this, and what's more, was beginning to feel afraid. This was all starting to feel like some kind of Twilight Zone episode, and I was ready to turn the channel. You told them that's not my name, right? You let them know it's just a nickname, so they wouldn't keep roaming around looking for some mook named Tony Pizza. Damien looked at me oddly for a minute before answering, I meant to, but it's the weirdest thing. I couldn't actually remember your name. I don't know if I mentioned it was a nickname either. I did give them Mike's address, though, so they might be waiting for you at home. I shook my head and walked out, telling him I supposed I'd go home and wait for the cops then. Couldn't remember my name. Damien and I had gone to high school together. He had known me since elementary school, though I wouldn't say we'd been friends. He was a burnout, but I didn't think his memory was that bad. As I walked up the sidewalk, my phone rang with a number that I didn't recognize. Turned out to be another bill collector looking for Tony Pizza. Tony owed this agency about $12,000. Nothing too crazy. And I let them know that I wasn't who they were looking for. They seemed pretty sure that I was, but I didn't have time to play with them. I hung up on them, but I had no sooner gotten my phone back in my pocket than it rang again. This one was from a parking garage a couple of blocks from my place, calling to let Pizza Tony know that his car was going to be towed if he didn't come to pick it up before the end of the day. So now it was cars, too. Mike was really pushing it now, and if the police were at my apartment, I was going to let them know about it. The cops were pulled up outside my apartment complex, and when they saw me, they asked if I was Tony Pizza. I scoffed. Do I look like Tony Pizza? One of the cops was a big-bellied, good old boy type, but the other was a little more professional, and he put a hand out to stop his partner from getting angry. Sorry, I'm Officer Page. This is Officer Gardner. We're looking for an individual who may be connected to a crime. Do you have a moment to speak with us on the matter? I agreed, and we stepped into the lobby of the complex so they didn't have to interview me on the sidewalk. We received an anonymous tip this morning about a suspect who left the scene of he weighed his words, a pretty nasty crime. There was no description of the suspect, but we were told they heard the individual call the person Tony Pizza the night before. I sighed. That's impossible. I was in my apartment all last night. Officer Gardner started to say something, but Officer Page cut him off. Is there anyone who can verify that? Thought about it and shook my head. Mike had worked late last night, and I'd been home alone until he had gotten there, about 11. He'd taken a shower and gone to bed after kissing me on top of the head. He had said, I love you, which made me feel a little weird because he hadn't said it for about 2 weeks by then. But I'd said it back and put it out of my mind. It was one red flag among many, and I was starting to see now that they were piling up. No, I guess my boyfriend could, but I can't seem to find him. I gave them Mike's information and they wrote it all down as they asked me more questions. What did I do for work? Did I own a car? Did I own a gun? On and on and on until I finally asked what exactly they were looking for. They said they couldn't really tell me about that, but as Officer Gardner looked at the information I'd given them about Mike, I saw him poke Officer Page and whisper something to him furiously. Officer Page crinkled his brow, nodding before turning back to me. You said your boyfriend, Michael August, came home last night about 11? Yeah, he kissed me on the forehead and went to bed. I don't know what time he left for work, but he was gone when I woke up. I heard the jingling of cuffs as Officer Page reached for his restraints. I am sorry, but I need to detain you until we can get this figured out. I took a step back and I saw the minute twitch from his free hand as he reached for his weapon. Don't do anything foolish, please. We just need to detain you for our own safety. You aren't being charged with anything yet. We just have to follow protocol. I submitted. I didn't seem to have much of a choice. I found myself being led to a nearby squad car as I heard the manager ask if they wanted to see the apartment. I don't know what we could expect to find, Officer Gardner stated, but the manager cut him off. No, I mean the other apartment.
I got an apartment rented out under the name Tony Pizza, if you'd like to take a peek. Gardner and Paige looked at each other, and as Paige took me to the car, I kept repeating that 402 wasn't my apartment, and I'd never once been inside it. Officer Paige put me in the back of the car, not saying anything, and as he closed the door, I was forced to sit in the car and wait for them to come back. The not knowing was killing me. The indecision and the unknown quantity of the apartment was driving me mad. What was in there? What would they find? More importantly, what had Mike been doing? I had to believe that Mike had been doing these things, changing things, charging things, opening accounts in my name, and now he was preparing to disappear and leave me holding the bag. When Officer Paige came back an hour later, he looked decidedly green around the gills. "I need to search you," he said, arming sweat off his forehead. "We're taking you to the station. I imagine there will be a lot of questions." "Why? What did you find? What's in that apartment?" He pulled me roughly from the back of the car and took a few things out of my pockets. My phone, my keys, my mace, and when it came to my wallet, he opened it and began to paw through it. Then he stopped suddenly, and I turned my head to see him looking at my ID card. His face darkened, anger spreading across it, and when he flipped the wallet around, he was practically shouting. "Why'd you lie to me? You could have just told us your name. Why waste our time when you knew we'd find out?" He had it so close to my face that I had to crane back a little to read it. But when I did, I felt my own face crinkle up in confusion. Instead of my name, the ID card read Tony Pizza. It was all a blur after that. They took me in, booked me, and I was suddenly the prime suspect in 5 murders. All the victims had been killed in their homes by someone with a knife, and trophies had been taken. Those trophies, usually the nipples of his victims, had been found in the apartment. They'd been laid out on a piece of wall art that depicted a freshly made pizza and seemed to tie in with my new identity. I told them I had no idea about any of this, and while they never found any evidence that I was in the apartment or at the crime scenes, the connections were too many to release me. Another bit of evidence hit me hard too. The last victim, the one killed the night before they came to talk to me, was what had sunk me. The man's name was Michael August, and the picture they showed me was not the man I'd been sleeping beside for the last 2 years. As I sit here and wait for my turn at court, I have to wonder if Tony Pizza wasn't the man I loved all along. I've heard some great nicknames in my time, but that one's certainly a pretty good one. Coming up next, we have a story about a man at his place of work, a place he feels secure, a place he feels like maybe nothing out of the ordinary could get him. Well, that is until he's caught with his pants down.
I've worked construction since dropping out of high school, so about 20 years. I know most people don't think much of it, but if you haven't shivered in the night lately, then thank a construction worker, because we've probably built the thing that's keeping the elements out. It's not glamorous work, but I've managed to claw my way up the ranks till I've got my own crew, run my own job sites, and live pretty comfortably. After 20 years, I've noticed that there are constants in this industry, but only 3 standouts: hard hats, lunch pails, and porta-johns. Job sites and porta-johns go together like, well, hand in glove. They're always necessary, always terrible to get stuck in for long periods of time, and always seem to smell both sterile and like a horse manure field. In 20 years, I've been inside more porta-johns than I have women, and unfortunately, I think some of them were cleaner. This particular time was a little different. A lot different. And it's something that sticks with me to this day. It's been weeks, months even, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat as I see that thing and hear it grind its teeth together. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. We were working on these new apartments, one of those big old buildings with about 8 units per floor and about 15 floors that are wedged between one another. One that's mostly the same thing. I was sipping my 5th cup of coffee when I heard the ominous rumble from my guts and knew what was coming. I'd had 2 breakfast burritos from Dolly's. She's an angel, but she goes heavy on the pepper. A whole pot of coffee, a hash brown as big as a pretzel, and now it was all coming to a head. The guy showing me the blueprints for the building looked at me with real worry and asked if I needed to take a minute. I told him I was fine, but he got about halfway through telling me about a problem with the wiring when it happened again. I gritted my teeth. That one might as well have been a starting pistol, and I told him I'd be right back. I made it to the lift just before the doors closed, and the guy who was taking it down looked worried as my stomach growled like a V8 with a bad carburetor. "Too many Dolly spicy chorizos, boss?" he said, and I nodded as the sweat started to stand out. "It's fighting with the pot of coffee and the hash brown in there, and it's anybody's bet who's gonna win. Remind me not to follow you into the John," he said with a laugh as the lift came to the ground floor. I was out and looking for one of the blue boxes that marked our porta potties. There were about 5 of them on the site, and wasn't long before I found one over by the office. I was waddling now, trying not to lose it right here in the yard, and the guys were laughing as I came ponderously towards my oasis in the desert. I closed the door, pushed the black locking bar into place, and had my pants down and my ass over the hole before I could embarrass myself any further. I checked for paper and was glad to find some, not always a given, and as the pressure began to relieve itself in the worst possible way, I closed my eyes and sighed happily. I'll save you the messy details, but needless to say, I was glad when it was finally over. I took out my phone, giving it some time to see if there was any more business to conduct. And that's when I became aware of the strange sound. First, I thought I might not be done, but I realized pretty quick that the slight splashing noise wasn't me. It was like something was making ripples in the water, splashing up a little as it stirred below, and I wondered if maybe I had dropped off a big enough payload to still be stirring in the tank. When it splashed again, this one high enough to wet my nethers with cold, dirty water, I stood up quickly. That had definitely been something alive splashing around in there, and I must have looked pretty silly just standing there, pants around ankles, as I stared into the hole. I fumbled at my phone, trying not to drop it in as well, and bent low so I could see into the fallow pit. It was hard to tell at first. The murky blue water looked like a subterranean lake more than anything, and the lighting inside wasn't helping matters in the least bit. I wondered if a snake had gotten in, maybe something bigger, and that was when I noticed something round coming out of the water. As it rose, I recognized it for what it was, the top of a very bald head. The tips of ears were sticking up from the surface of the muck, and as it rose I could see the beginnings of eyes as well. They were open, staring, utterly devoid of anything human. I stumbled back, nearly falling down as my feet tangled in my pants, and bumped hard against the door as the whole edifice shook on its base. What the hell was that, I wondered? Had some homeless guy gotten into our shitter? Had some freak gotten down there with nasty stuff on his mind? I didn't know, but what I did know was that I was locked in here with him. I reached for the lock. The light from my phone held forward so I could see, and when I heard a splash, I turned back in a hurry. The light from my phone fell across the opening, and the head that rose from it looked like some kind of creature from one of those old stories my friends and I had told to spook each other when we were young. Its skin was inky, though that could have had more to do with where he was residing. Its ears were long and pointed like a bat, and its eyes were white like a full moon. It rose from the festering swamp like a vampire from an old movie, its body simply rising without any mechanism to lift it. I wasn't sure if it was tall or capable of levitation or something, but its face came fully over the lip of the toilet lid. I saw the worst of it then. Its mouth was stretched into a perpetual grin, the teeth long and sharp as they fit together like puzzle pieces. As neatly as they came together, they still appeared to be too long for its mouth. They looked like they might be painful to it, the grin more of a grimace than anything. And they were gravel gray and slimy with something more viscous than saliva. In the dim light of the little toilet, it rose up to tower over me. It kept rising, its head nearly brushing the ceiling, and I could see that its arms and legs were indeed longer than expected. They were nearly twice as long as its body, the hands ending in cruel claws. It leered at me, reveling in my fear, and I was paralyzed by it. The creature was terrifying, but I don't think that was all of it. There's certain places where you seem to believe that there's an illusion of safety. Your home, your bed, your bathroom, places you're at your most vulnerable and comfortable. You think of these places as safe, like sanctuaries, and when these places are violated, it feels like a violation of your person. It opened its mouth, giving me a good look at those gravel gray fangs, and as it hissed softly, it leaned forward like it was getting ready to strike. I don't know how I did it. I shouldn't have been able to move at all, but my hand seemed to come up all on its own and flick the plastic bar back that was holding the door closed. I went from cowering on the floor of a filthy porta-potty to scrambling across the yard of the job site, the light flooding in as it sent the creature shrinking back into that dark hole. I had crab walked about 20 feet when I realized that I hadn't had time to pull my pants up, and I was scrambling half naked across a job site with hundreds of people on it. I didn't think all of them were watching me, but that was way more eyes than I wanted there to be. I jerked my pants up, started yelling about some kind of animal being in the porta-potty. Some of the guys ran over to investigate. Others came to see if I was okay, but ultimately they didn't find nothing. I told the authorities when they got there too, that something had been in the tank, and it had come at me, spitting mad. They got somebody out there to drain it, but they didn't find nothing. I hadn't expected they would. Whatever it was, it had gone back to hiding in the muck. I had the unit closed down and told the vendor that he could come and get it. He offered to bring me a new one, but that didn't help. I do my business off-site now, but I'll remember that grinning, dripping, terrible face for as long as I live.
One more story for you, and I think I've got a pretty good one to go out on. It's a tale about a man out doing something uncomfortable with people that he likes, when suddenly he finds strangeness in a place where we all like to feel well taken care of and well protected. a bathroom in an unfamiliar area. So let's hear a little story about the touch of a stranger.
It should have been the least stressful part of his day, but it was something that Steve would never quite get over. The kids had been bugging him to take them to the fair all week, but Steve would have rather taken off his skin with a cheese grater. He'd been working all week, his legs were killing him, and that wasn't the biggest issue at play either. The thought of bumping elbows and shoulders with people in a setting like that made him feel squeeby just thinking about it, though Steve would never admit to it. Steve had been plagued with haphophobia since he was young. It had been worse when he was younger. Steve hadn't even wanted his parents to touch him, but the thought of strangers touching him would send him into a near catatonic state. He spent years telling people not to touch him, avoiding hugs and handshakes, and stepping around people if they got too close. This set him apart from his peers and made him a bit of an outsider. After years of work and a lot of therapy, he'd gotten past some of it, but he still really didn't like to be touched by people he didn't know. Seeing his kids upset was hard, but Steve just couldn't bring himself to plunge into that kind of environment. Not until his wife had guilted him about it. "I think you ought to take the kids to the fair, Steve." He'd been half asleep, but snorted awake as he rolled over to look at her. The two were in bed, Lisa having gotten off a little earlier than usual, and they were looking forward to a much-needed night of sleep. Steve had nodded, ready to slip off into oblivion, when Lisa had spoken up. "Huh?" Steve asked, as articulate as ever. "You should take them to the fair. It means a lot to them. I'd do it myself if I didn't have to work until 11 on Saturday." Steve grasped for an excuse that would make her let him sleep and drop the conversation. "So tired from work. The boss has been working us hard, and I don't really think I have the energy to putter around the fair." She rolled over, wrapping her arms around him as he leaned back against her. Lisa would never know how much work it had taken to get to this point, and he never intended to let her find out. He had never told her about his mental issues. He was afraid that she would see him as weak or an oddball and might leave him because of it. He doubted it. They had been married for years, but it was always something in the back of his mind. I know it's been a long week for you, but it would make your kids happy. Please, for me." Steve wanted to tell her no, but it was hard to say no when she was pressed up against him. There weren't many people Steve could stand to have this close. The list was very short. Lisa, the kids, and maybe his mother. He wanted to make her happy, wanted to make the kids happy. So, despite his better judgment, he agreed to take them. So, just before sunset on Saturday night, Steve found the three of them standing at the ticket booth just outside the teeming throng of people that made up the town fair. Even now, he could feel the presence of the crowd. It teemed with life, the sweating masses that would push at him, their skin rubbing at him as he and his kids walked by. The odor was nauseating, even from here, and Steve could feel his skin crawl as he paid the ticket taker with shaky hands. As they headed through the rusty chain link surrounding the fairground with his oldest, Robbie, and his youngest, Charles, Steve knew this would be the biggest test of his mental health in some time. From the instant he stepped inside, he could feel the combined weight of the crowd pressing against him. No one actually touched him. They were a little too polite for that. But the oppressive nature of so many people moving around him was still a lot. The combined smell of sugary fair food, stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and the puff of dry earth from the fairground was like a cloud around him. The warmth of so many people so close to him and his kids reminded him of being too warm in his winter clothes. It was stifling, the miasma of emotions at odds with the smiling faces of his kids, and Steve tried to keep it together as his skin threatened to crawl right off his body. At first, Steve believed he could distract himself from all this. The food smelled good, but it was hard to keep it down with the combined smells of humanity wafting around him. Fried this and battered that went into his stomach, but even the culinary oddities couldn't keep his anxiety at bay. People sat too close to him, their heat radiating into his skin, and Steve began to feel claustrophobic as the crowd pressed against him outside the food tent. Due to COVID protocol, the fair had to ask guests to only eat in designated areas, but that didn't seem to be stopping most of them from walking around with small buffets in their arms. As he came out of the tent like a man who's seen a ghost, Steve thought maybe the rides would be a better distraction. The rides looked fun, but the seats were so close that it was hard to quantify as a distraction. Every ride pushed him closer to his fellow riders, and their skin on his was unbearable. No matter how close he pulled his arms in, no matter how small he made himself, he could still feel the warm, sweaty, disgusting feeling of the other riders beside him as their rubbery flesh pushed against his. He spent every ride feeling more and more like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin, and when Charles reached for his hand at the end of every ride, it took everything he had to grasp it. He felt ready to puke, ready to scream, and after a while he just let the kids ride the rides as he sat back and tried to keep control of himself. Rob and Charles had gone off to ride a collection of rides around the bench that he was sitting on, and as they moved, Steve moved as well. He was aware that they could get snatched pretty easily in this environment, but Rob was stocky for his age, and Steve hoped his size would dissuade anyone from messing with him or his little brother. As he sat on the metal bench, almost feeling the heat of every ass that had touched it before, he wanted to pull his knees up to his chest and feel the comfortable bump of his heart against his kneecaps. He hadn't done that since he was a kid, something that had driven his mother crazy, but he longed for that comfortable press now as the unnamed masses flooded around him. Steve would have never believed that there were so many people in this small town, but it appeared they were all on display tonight. The crowd was thick as they wove up the asphalt path, and Steve felt for his inhaler before realizing it was also something he hadn't used since high school. As the hyperventilation threatened to overtake him, a new player joined the game in the form of a loud groan in his guts. Steve wasn't sure if it had been the deep-fried Oreos or the batter-fried Twinkies, but they had put his stomach in an uproar. He could feel his guts bubbling, the rides clearly doing more harm than good in that respect. He made eye contact with Rob, cutting his eyes to the porta-potty and nodding his head towards it. Rob seemed to struggle with the implications for a moment, eyes darting between his dad and the little plastic shit box, before he finally put the pieces together and gave his dad a thumbs up. Steve was off the bench like a shot, his guts feeling like they were full of eels, and he locked the door as it clattered shut behind him. As he let his jeans hit the floor of the filthy bathroom, Steve felt a wave of calm roll through him. That might sound strange, feeling at ease in a disgusting toilet, but as his backside hit the plastic seat and the sound of the fair buzzed softly outside the rough walls, Steve found that the isolation was what he'd been seeking. Here it was just him and his thoughts, and he breathed a sigh of relief for the first time that night. As he did his business, he felt a sense of ease take the place of the anxiety he had felt for the last few hours. It felt like he might be able to return to the fair now, his burbling guts appeased as he purged the combination of fried foods. He heard his leaving splash below him, but didn't get up immediately. Steve wanted just a few more minutes, a few more seconds of quiet, and he would sometimes wonder if that had been his downfall. The universe, it seems, had found him greedy, and his punishment came a half a second before his eyes opened. He stiffened as he felt it, and could feel every hair on his body standing at attention. Something had touched him. It felt like a finger, just the pad of a single digit, but the feel was unmistakable as it caressed his inner thigh. Steve was frozen, his ease and peace gone as fast as the sour mash that had brought him here. This couldn't be real. Nothing was below him, nothing that could touch him at any rate. His anxiety was playing tricks on him, but if it was very convincing. He could feel it creeping up his thigh, going higher and higher. As it threatened to invade something too intimate for his mind to accept, Steve felt himself surge forward, falling onto the floor as his pants tripped his scrambling legs. In the murky light of the porta-potty, Steve saw something as it descended back into the muck of the tank. It was clearly a hand, the finger extended, and as he tried to press himself through the plastic portal to the noisy outside world, he saw it rise from the muck. It was a man, thin as a rail, who seemed to grow taller as he rose from the cesspool. His arms were cartoonishly long, their length dripping with noxious sludge. As he smiled, Steve saw teeth that looked too big for a normal mouth. The crap fell off him with thick plops, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come, and when he leaned down to loom over him, Steve felt sure that he would simply unhinge his jaw and swallow him up. Then he slid back into the repulsive stew like a reverse jack-in-the-box, and Steve felt the door open to release him into the barely lighted world. When Steve came scrambling out of the stall, his pants still around his ankles, he was screaming for help. There's something in there. There's something in the tank," he yelled, people gathering as he tried to get his pants up again. The police may have taken their time, but the fair workers had already quartered off the toilet. People watched the door, not wanting to let anyone get out, and the crowd that surrounded Steve was very supportive. He was sitting on the same bench he had run from, a blanket around him as he tried to ignore the well-meaning strangers who tried to comfort him. He'd told the crowd what had happened, blushing at the details as he relived them, and the police arrived about the same time the pumper truck did. His son sat beside him, comforting him as he sat shaking, and he was glad for the firmness of their hands this time. An officer took his statement as the men with the hose set to work. They were using a small pumper hose, not wanting to accidentally suck up whoever might be in there, and Steve couldn't help but watch the hose jiggle and jounce as they emptied the tank. The officers had just finished taking his statement, telling Steve they would get the guy, when the truck driver came up and spoke in a low voice to the officer. The officer rolled his eyes and nodded, flipping the notebook closed as he started to go. "Wait," Steve stammered, aren't you going to arrest the guy?" "Tank's empty, sir. There's no one in there." But, Steve started, his anxiety rising again. That's impossible. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes." "Be that as it may, tank's empty, sir. It's a crime to misuse law enforcement, sir. I'd suggest you let me get back to work." As they left, so too left the crowd, many of them now whispering darkly as Steve and his sons were left sitting on the bench. They had left then, the fair mostly over by this point, but it seemed the mistrust came with them. If you didn't want to take us, you should have just said so instead of doing something like that." They'd been driving home when Rob said it, and when Steve looked in the rearview mirror, his son appeared on the verge of rage tears. "I didn't make it up," Steve said, wanting to take offense of his son's tone, but understanding his embarrassment. "I know what I saw." Charles was silent, his embarrassment harder for his 6-year-old mind to put into words, but Rob seemed to have a pretty good grasp on his anger. "Yeah, right," he said, looking out the window sullenly. The drive home seemed to take forever, but it still wasn't long enough for Steve to find a rebuttal. His sons piled out when they got home, and Steve could only watch as they went inside and slammed the door behind them. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to rail against his oldest for the way he'd talked to him, but as the anxiety and the shame built up inside him, all he could do was lean his head against the steering wheel and sob silently into the unyielding rubber. He felt violated, doubly so after the judging whispers of the crowd, and he knew the shame wouldn't wash off in the shower. The isolation he felt now brought none of the comfort it had earlier, and as Steve tried to make sense of what he felt, he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He just sat in the driveway, crying into his steering wheel, his impotence almost worse than the fear of being touched. The stranger who had touched him tonight would remain a stranger, and that fact was the worst part of all to Steve.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't worry, we'll be back next week with more great stories and more cozy horror for you to enjoy. Till next time, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.